Welcome back, everybody, to the AMR Origin series. This is episode 26. My name is Greg Fisher, and I'm going to be chatting with one of the authors of an upcoming AMR paper entitled How Firms' Value Capture Affects Value Creation in Its Ecosystem. So David Ross is here to talk with me about this paper, a little bit of its background, its evolution, its history, so that you as our listeners can understand a little bit more about how AMR papers are developed, how they evolve, and how they ultimately come to be in the form in which you get to read them. So David, welcome to AMR Origin series. Can you just give us a little bit of background on yourself, where you're currently located, how you've evolved to be there, and just what your research identity is?
Absolutely, Greg. And so thank you for having me on this series. I'm excited to be part of it. So I'm currently a professor in the management department at the University of Florida. I guess you could call me a strategy professor, although nowadays it seems like everyone in strategy does a little entrepreneurship too. So and my co-author, Coach John, is a finance professor at New York University, and that's actually where I got my PhD. And he was on my dissertation committee way back in the day. And in fact, this project doesn't go back all the way to my dissertation, but it does go back certainly almost to the beginning of the previous decade, if not the end of the last one. So this has been one of the longest things I've ever worked on, not continuously.
Well, that's we'll get to dive into a little bit of that story in a moment and just how it evolved through that long period of time, why you chose to put it down, pick it back up again, and some of those things, and then how it ultimately landed up in AMR. But before we get into that, can you just give us a little bit of a sense of what the paper's about? So its title is How a Firm's Value Capture Affects Value Creation in Its Ecosystem. So if you were to sort of be forced to give a 1-minute elevator pitch about this paper, what would you say it's about?
Well, so first of all, I should probably let your listeners know that it is a formal modeling paper. Okay, so that's one thing to bear in mind. So essentially, this paper is about ecosystems. So for those of you who may not be familiar with that idea, you can think of an ecosystem as a meta organization, a bunch of firms and individuals that are interacting, transacting with each other to co-create value, as the saying goes. So what would be an example? You could think of Walmart and its many suppliers, or you could think of Apple and its many app developers, suppliers, and so on. Now, what you might notice from those two examples is that each example I gave you had a lead firm, a dominant firm at the center that's the ecosystem is built around. That is not always the case, but it's true very often. So there is obviously an enormous literature on ecosystems, as I'm sure many of you folks know. One of the things that people talk about a lot with the ecosystem literature is what you might call complementarities. Sometimes people say spillovers or externalities. And the basic idea is that you have one person or firm in the ecosystem, and they do something that makes the product that everyone's working towards, the value proposition, more valuable or maybe less valuable. So an example would be an app for the iPhone that's going to make the actual phone or iPad and so forth more valuable. Now, that's a positive complementarity. But sometimes complementarities are negative too if you're competing for a same resource or you're creating pollution or something. So that idea has been out there. What our angle here is that there's sort of a separate literature in ecosystems that talks about how lead firms can, capture the value that's being created, because after all, most of them are profit-seeking entities. They have shareholders. But hang on, if you're out there running around trying to capture as much value as possible, how is that going to be received by the other players in the ecosystem? Are they maybe going to say, well, I don't know if I'm going to try to develop this app, or in Walmart's case, work so hard to tie into your inventory management system? And is that a good or a bad thing? Well, we analyze that with a formal model, and I can talk more about the details of that, but just to give you the elevator pitch, what we basically show is that the impact of this value capture by this lead firm that has greater or less market power, that depends a lot on the nature of the complementarities. So if the complementarities are mostly positive, then this value capture can be disastrous. because basically by disincentivizing everyone to sort of contribute to the ecosystem, everything kind of falls apart. Oh, Greg's not going to try really hard to develop his product, so I'm not going to try. And then he thinks, oh, I'm not going to try. And the whole thing can completely collapse. But sometimes you can have situations where different players in the ecosystem might be competing with each other. They might be generating negative complementarities. And the very interesting thing is, and I don't think this has ever been pointed out verbally or in a formal model in any econ paper ever, even outside the ecosystem context, that the value capture by the lead firm with market power can actually turn into almost a socially beneficial tax at that point, disincentivizing people from imposing these negative externalities on each other. You can almost think of it like the government taxing people to use a fishing resource or taxing people so they don't pollute. And so you can actually end up producing more value overall than you would have if the lead firm, say, was sharing more value with its the other players in the system. And then we go on to talk, which I'm about a lot of other things, the governance form of the lead firm, whether it does face competition, what its incentives are, and so on. But what I've told you so far is the basic idea of the paper.
And just a few follow-ups on that, just to clarify a few things. The first is, so this idea of a lead firm within an ecosystem, how does that relate to the platform literature and the literature sort of on platforms? Because it seems like there could be some commonalities and similarities, but is Walmart a platform? I'm not 100% sure. So I'd love to know, you've obviously, a lot of your sites are back to the literature that I would talk about as the literature on multi-sided platforms. And so how do you either distinguish from or relate back to that literature?
So let me answer that this way. People don't always agree on nomenclature. And so some folks may use the word platform differently than I'm going to use it. But in a very narrow construal, a platform is essentially kind of like in a way, a marketplace that brings more than a couple of different groups together. A platform as such can be an ecosystem with a lead firm. The lead firm, so you can have a platform ecosystem where the platform itself is the lead firm. You could think of Google as a platform that's linking firms that want to advertise with searchers that want to buy things as being exactly that kind of thing. But the ecosystem is kind of broader. So I guess one simple way of answering your question is that platforms can be thought of as a very specific kind of ecosystem. And we think our model certainly applies to that context, but we also need to provide the caveat that platforms also have some other special features like network effects and so on that would have to be added to the model if you wanted to make a model just about platforms.
Okay, that's super helpful. I did, as someone who's not deeply embedded in this literature, I did find like the concrete examples. So two things: someone who's not deeply embedded in this literature and not a formal modeler or not trained in formal modeling, I found the examples throughout this paper to be extremely helpful and valuable, just in terms of concretizing. And you've alluded to some of those examples already, so that was certainly helpful. Who is this paper targeted at? Who's sort of the primary academic audience for this paper?
Well, so the primary academic audience for this paper would be people who are interested in ecosystems, which would be a lot of people in strategy and entrepreneurship these days, technology and management and so on. However, we think that the paper has actually ties into some or latches onto some pretty widely diffused mechanisms in the economy. So as you talked about some of the examples, one of the examples we have is ocean spray, the primary cranberry and grapefruit processor. And people don't always think about that as an ecosystem, but it really kind of is. And the other members are the farms that contribute to it. But one very interesting thing about that is it's a cooperative. They've chosen the way they mitigate the bargaining power and market power rent capture that the lead firm would have in this case is by owning it themselves instead of having it be owned by a separate party. Also, there's a literature that goes by you can call it organizational strategy, you could call it governance, kind of depends on who you are, which is probably where I would mostly locate most of my own research and strategy, which is very concerned, of course, as the name would imply, by how you organize things inside a firm. And there's a lot going on with that. You could think about some sort of common resource, could be even the copy center that you and your colleagues use at your university. And how do you allocate use of that common resource? And we think our paper speaks to that a lot. And you could think of that as a case of network externalities. The more copying and printing you're doing at the local, the Xerox in the hall, the less that your colleague can do. And so there's a way of thinking about that. So we think, deep down, fundamentally, if you look at the underlying drivers, a lot of people, we hope, would be interested in the paper.
Yeah, I've got to say the ocean spray example really hit me over the head in the sense that, you hear the word ecosystem, you hear the word platform being used, and many of the sort of initial examples, whether it's Apple or Google that come out, you sort of categorize all those things in a particular category. And then the ocean spray example comes out with cranberry farmers and cooperative, and all of a sudden you start to say, this is a lot more generalizable than what we might initially default to. So I think some of those sort of suggestions and examples in the paper are very, very helpful for understanding this idea more broadly. Now, I just want to ask you to double click on like the primary finding of this thing, or to even re-explain to me, because it is somewhat counterintuitive. In the primary finding of the formal model is that when you've got and maybe just get you to re-explain it rather than me trying to re-explain it, because I think to me it's somewhat counterintuitive and somewhat intriguing in what it implies for how we might think about managing ecosystems where there is a lead provider or a lead firm or a lead actor in that setting.
Sure. So if what you're thinking of, and you didn't literally say this, but I'm just guessing, is that the lead firm sucking money out of the ecosystem with its market power can actually be a good thing, can actually get you to the theoretic optimum value creation.
Yeah, that's the point I was primarily intrigued by.
Yeah, so that is counterintuitive. So I think the basic idea is this: you imagine that you have a bunch of members of an ecosystem that are investing either literal cash or their own effort in trying to, do whatever it is they do as part of the ecosystem, whether it's growing cranberries or whether it's, building a new app or designing some other kind of part for a more, manufacturing firm. And how much are they going to invest in that? And if they're only going to be thinking about themselves, presumably, and they're basically going to invest up to the point where the expected profits they get match the amount that they invest in time and money, right? And that's pretty much fine if how much they invest doesn't directly impact the other members of the ecosystem. But suppose it does. Suppose there's something about the activities they undertake that bids up the price of a common resource, or uses up a common resource, or creates pollution that interferes in the business of other members of the ecosystem. Then you'd want, in theory, right, them to take this social cost, formerly an externality, and sort of add it to the cost side of their little little equation that they use in economics class, and just then continue to try up to the point, invest up to the point where this now larger cost would match. And that would, of course, be a somewhat lower level of activity because now the costs are high, right? Well, it turns out, of course, that the only way to really make that work it would be some sort of tax, and there's no one who will levy a tax in this ecosystem. It's all a bunch of private actors. Well, but suppose that the lead firm really is levying a tax, but it's not called a tax. It's they're going to take some money from the efforts of this member of the ecosystem because the lead firm has market power. It's kind of like, you go out there, you design a product, and then but you can't make money from that product by yourself. You have to give it to, say, Walmart, who's going to pay you a certain amount. And we know how tough a bargainer Walmart can be. Apple also is pretty powerful within their ecosystem. They bully their app developers sometimes, not always to take rent, but they do it. We all have heard these stories. That is going to say, oh, wait a minute, we're not going to get $100 of the value we create here. We're only going to get 70 or 50 or 90. That is going to cause you also to reduce the amount of investment and effort you undertake, potentially back down towards the socially optimal level, just as if some benign central planner, remember that from econ class, had come in and levied exactly the right kind of tax. So that's essentially how that result works. And, once you explain it, it makes sense, but somehow We've never found it anywhere else. So not in all the natural resource economics papers. You mean they're always focusing on the behavior of governments and so on.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's exactly what I was alluding to. And there are other sort of more nuanced things that stem from that in the paper, but that is the sort of central insight was at least it was insightful to me. Tell me a little bit about, you alluded to this project having taken quite a long time, that you have known your co-author quite a long time, and you've sort of had it back and forth. Tell me a little bit about where it got started and then some of those stop-starts along the way.
Well, so that's the, so yeah. So there's different ways, excuse me, that you can approach writing a theory, and clearly a full treatment of that would go well beyond this particular discussion. But something that people sometimes do in formal modeling, it's probably more common in certain kinds of finance and macroeconomic modeling, where you have what's called a general equilibrium, and I'll explain what that is when you just build a model and see how it works. Now, let me first explain what a general equilibrium is. Most of the time in strategy, we think in terms of what an economist would call a partial equilibrium. You have a market and there's supply and demand. But if you stop and think about it, that's not the entire world, right? I mean, there's money coming in, the buyers, the demand side of the market already has money, the suppliers the firms are paying people, they're getting supplies, but that's not model. It's just that one little market. A general equilibrium is what might be called in an NK modeling world or a Carnegie Mellon model world, like a closed system. It's supposed to be the entire economy. Yes, a very highly stylized, massively simplified version of the economy, but it's still everything. There's no leakage. Nothing's coming in, nothing's going out. This paper has a general equilibrium model. The ecosystem we model is for the most part, completely self-contained. It's not unusual when people build general equilibrium models to build them and just we'll try to get the main elements in there, and then we'll see how the thing works. You can almost think of it like someone who's trying to figure out the aerodynamics of a car, and they can't possibly build, they can't work it out in advance. So they build the little model of the car, and they put the little strip of, what they call paper, and they blow in the wind tunnel. And so we built this model originally where the lead firm was going to be a bank, and the other members of the ecosystem are going to be savers and depositors. And there's going to be a little economy of a small town or a little region or something like that. And we were interested to see how it worked. We were thinking in terms of bank runs and modeling it some way using something called a global gain, which I can explain, but it's technical and so on. And we kind of slowly realized it wasn't a eureka moment. It was more of a eureka eon or something, that actually what we'd ended up doing was building something that was a lot more general and also probably a lot more of interest to people outside the field of finance, more even probably, I would say, mostly management and industrial organization economics. And so that's how things evolved, but it took quite a long time. If you look at the acknowledgements to the paper, you'll see all this thing was in various names, was presented at lots of finance conferences and finance departments. And then we kind of evolved towards the management literature over time. And it's a very different paper. I mean, if you strip it down to its essentials, it's similar, but I mean, it's a very different paper than it was in 2011.
So 2011, it starts out sort of orientated on banking and finance, and
yeah.
And what were some of the sort of things that pushed you towards this sort of more strategy management orientation? And then how did you land up, in 2019 submitting it to AMR?
So a bunch of things. So one is that the original version of the paper didn't have the result that we just talked about a few moments ago, where complementarities could be negative, and therefore the tax the effective tax of the rent extraction by the lead firm was a good thing. And once we realized that, we're like, oh, wow, there are social implications of this that we hadn't appreciated. Then we also realized that who's really interested in complementarities, spillovers, or externalities? Well, there's some people who are interested in that in natural resource economics. That's a real field. It's not huge, but it's much more folks in management, especially people who study these what are now called meta organizations. It's a big deal. A lot of people say that Apple's big advantage, the iPhone's ecosystem big advantage over Android, at least for many years, was that they had a better ecosystem around it. It wasn't just the product itself. And so we realized, oh, hey, this is going to be a lot more interesting, we think, for them. It did take us a while to figure out how to talk to that literature. It's not something that I've done a lot of work in. Certainly my finance professor colleague hasn't. And even, I guess this is getting into something you might ask me later, but one of the things that certainly happened over the course of the review process at AMR is that the reviewers and the editor strongly guided us and gave us a lot of good comments and feedback about how to make the paper more relevant for that literature, both substantively and also in terms of positioning.
And are you and your co-author both equally comfortable on the formal modeling side, or are one or the other of you taking the lead in that regard, or are you sort of able to spar in that regard and figure things out together? Give us a little bit of a sense of that relationship.
So I did most of the formal modeling here, but that's probably more because I'm junior and he's been around for a long time. He became quote unquote famous for formal modeling papers. Nowadays, he does a lot of empirical work as well. I started out, I started out, there was a period of time several years ago where it looked like formal modeling was the next big thing in management research. And I was doing a lot of stuff then. I think that might have receded somewhat. There's still an appetite for it, but I don't know if it's quite as, the most recent generation is, listening to music as they always do. So we both worked on it, but we both are familiar with it, but I was literally the model person on this paper.
And did the model change? Just talk to me a little bit about now this revise and resubmit process. And I'd love to know it. You've alluded to some sort of quite substantive changes in terms of the framing and the anchoring and how do you enter this literature. And then I'd love to know, did the model essentially stay the same and that have to change, or did you have change on both fronts and you were sort of navigating both? Because a formal model it's like it's a proof. It's sort of got its fundamental elements, and I'm interested to know whether the reviewers engaged with it enough to sort of push you on certain aspects of that, or were they more just pushing on the framing of the paper and where it's situated?
Yes. So I would say that with respect to the AMR review process itself, it was mostly additive. A lot of the other additional analysis that got added, so what would be an example? We considered the possibility the lead firm faces competition. We looked at things. Imagine that the what we call agents. So basically, the other members of the ecosystem could self-organize in some way to do whatever was best for them. What if the lead firm could just decide, this is how much you're going to, what if they could pick their own market power? We looked at a lot of those different cases. We also looked at a contract, which was actually turned out to be pretty interesting in this setting. I don't want to get too technical in this discussion, but this paper uses what you might call value capture theory. It's this cooperative game theoretic approach to modeling that goes back to Brandenburger and Stewart, and folks like Mike Ryle done a lot of work on it more recently. And it's somewhat unusual in that literature to have contracts, but because that seemed like a natural way to solve the lead firm's problem in this case, like, hey, I'm going to write I have all this market power, but I'm going to write a contract that protects you. What would they do and how would that work? And it turns out that sometimes that you think they could do that, but sometimes what would be required if you take it from outside the model and put it into the real world looks like that might be hard to actually implement, which then implies, of course, that the non-contracting version of the model has empirical traction. So a lot of basically expanded a lot in those areas, I would say, in addition to the other stuff that I already mentioned.
Awesome. So can you step back and say, I think this is probably the first formal model you published in AMR. The AMR hasn't been publishing. Second, okay.
No, the other one, I was like one of the very early ones in 2014, I think it was.
Okay.
So, yeah,
because they haven't been doing it for all that long.
No.
And so, but part of what we want to do with this series is sort of encourage more junior people to understand sort of what are some of the do's and don'ts of publishing certain kinds of papers. And I think this is probably one of the kinds of papers that's generally spoken about least, or has the least sort of insider knowledge that's been exposed outside. So what were some of your insights, perspectives, lessons that you might pass on to someone else who thinks, I think I've got a theoretical paper or a conceptual paper that's largely based on a formal model that you think would be useful for them to understand prior to submitting to AMR, that would give them a better chance of navigating that process and getting through that process.
So is this advice for someone who would be submitting a formal paper to AMR?
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, let me just say, and I know you know this, that Rich McAdock recently wrote a guide that published up in AMR recently, which is a very, very, I think, very useful in exactly that way. But I think that, for example, one thing that we think that you alluded to earlier is we have a lot of examples in this paper, some of which might be, oh, that's clearly an ecosystem, and some of which aren't, which are thought-provoking in their own way. So having a lot of examples, people in strategy, and to some degree, people in organizational behavior also do a lot of case teaching. So they're used to generalizing from specific examples. That helps a lot. The other thing is that, look, and this is a little secret. Okay, this is about economists and finance people too. Most of them can't read formal model papers either. Okay, so especially general equilibrium papers. Okay, this is just a fact, but don't tell anyone. So what that means for you, if you're thinking of writing a formal paper, is that you have to explain to people who might be interested in or cite your paper in words, which for the purpose of AMR means the English language, both in the introduction, what are the big results and what's the intuition, and then as you go along, give them the Rosetta Stone in English the whole way. You have to do this. If you don't do this, then the last people who ever cite your paper are likely to be the reviewer or who read your paper will be the reviewers. Okay, this is very important.
I just want to double down on how important that is, because it just opens the paper up to a much broader audience. So if I put on an associate editor hat, I'm thinking, is this paper going to be cited? Is it going to be picked up by other people? Is it readable by a broader audience? And that is critical. So that sort of writing it with in the English language, with unpacking your results in a way that a non-modeler can understand, just seems so important.
And the other thing about that is that, and this is something I think my advisor, Bernie Young, said years ago, was that, if you can't explain what formal your formal results are in plain words, then maybe you don't quite understand them either. Sometimes I completely agree with people who say that, sometimes you really do have to have the math to have figured out things. But once you've figured it out, you really should be able to back it, to retrace your steps in English. So people who, have trouble reading math, and let's face it, people often say that math is a language. That analogy may not be perfect, but for this purpose, I think it does make a lot of sense. It's if you don't speak math, or in the particular kind of math that's used in this paper all the time, you can't expect to be, someone can't expect you to be completely conversant in, right? So yeah.
So so this paper's been out for a while. Have you gotten any sort of feedback since it's been published on the AMR website? And have you been surprised by anything that anyone said about sort of things that it might have sparked, or anyone that's taken interest in it? What sort of traction do you feel like it's picking up? And what are some of the things you've heard from people who might not have originally read it?
Well, it's been up on the website for a little while. I don't think it's attracted a huge amount of attention yet. I think it's going to be published this coming quarter, right? So yeah. I'm interested to see. Frequently, I typically find, and this isn't just with AMR, that when papers actually, when you get the announcement that the paper's out, that's when you start getting emails from people that because they subscribe to these things and stuff. So we'll see. It's been cited a few times. It hasn't taken off. But look, this is something also that people who want to do formal modeling papers really need to know. They don't get cited that much generally. I mean, I think Rich McAdock has one formal paper with a few thousand sites on Google Scholar. That's extremely unusual. So if you're someone who works, I'm just going to make this very blunt. If you're someone who happens to work at a school where large numbers of citations are important for the P&T process, writing a lot of formal papers might not be the right thing to do, just because look, why do papers get cited? There's a lot of reasons they get cited. But one of the reasons they get cited, I'm not saying it's the only reason, but one of the reasons they get cited is there are a bunch of other people doing very similar work. And there just will never be a lot of people doing formal modeling.
Yeah.
So it just is what it is.
But the discussion section of this paper is very rich. It's got policy implications. It's got implications from a sort of strategy standpoint. It's got and that strategy at both the firm level and then elevating to the sort of notion of a meta-organizational level. And so I'd love for you just to try and allude to some of those broader implications, unpack a few of what you see as the broader implications for this paper and where you think it could have influence if people picked it up and read it.
Well, I think that it's been underappreciated how important rent extraction, value capture is by lead firms in these ecosystems. People have talked about what's called entering complementary markets. So suppose Apple were to see that one of its app developers were making a lot of money with a particular app, and Apple's like, oh, we're going to start selling our own version of that. And if someone expects that you might do that, it can dampen their incentives. People have talked about that. It's important to talk about that. But just the more general notion that because a lead firm might have a lot of ability in its transactions with different elements of the ecosystem to suck out a lot of value can cause entities not to invest in value co-creation. That's something that lead for three different groups of people we need to think about a lot more. If you are the lead firm or you run it, this is something you need to be vividly aware of. And sometimes it can take a long time. We don't use this example in the paper, but arguably the reason that Coke and Pepsi ended up buying up a lot of their bottlers and merging them and then kind of co-owning them, sort of spinning them off, and sort of was to some degree motivated by this. They needed the bottlers to co-invest in a much more expansive product line. It wasn't just going to be sodas anymore, but water also, vitamin water, hot drinks and stuff. And the bottlers were like, why should we do that when you people make all the money? I mean, and of course, some of it was also size and economies of scale, but that was, and so finally, like Coke was like, all right, we're just going to form our own little M&A team, buy all these up. So, but it took them a long time to do that. Sometimes these things need to be seen in advance. Other times you want to be forward thinking, like be members of the ecosystem and say, hey, we're a bunch of cranberry farmers out here, and we need someone but we can't, we're not a branded fruit juice processor. If we allow one of the big companies to play that role for us, they're going to have us over a cranberry juice barrel, right? And so maybe we need to do that ourselves. And of course, that's a major undertaking for a bunch of cranberry producers, but sometimes that's necessary. And finally, and we don't talk about this a lot in management, but people in public policy need to think about this also. Sometimes the reason that you might not have a market for something is because if there were a market, the lead firm that would be in that market would be sucking up all the rent. And so the market never forms. We actually show that formally later in the paper. And so thinking not just about what do they call the Herfindahl index or whatever, the market concentration in a market that exists, but what it would be, being more forward thinking about this, we think, and also just recognizing that we also show this is one of the analyses that the reviewers pushed us to do. The lead firm, if you leave it up to the lead firm, they will never choose the right amount of rent extraction for themselves. They'll always take too much. Yes, they will take into account somewhat that they dampen the incentives of the other people, but they're always going to take too much. So if you really want to get to the optimal level, you need this, with positive complementarities, I should say, then you need to have some other entity, whether it's the members or some third party, intercede.
Fascinating, and that's extremely helpful. And it was exactly those sort of discussion points that I think really make the discussion a fascinating read and a sort of generative read in terms of getting new ideas. So congrats on this, on getting this paper out. It's a very, very interesting perspective. I think it helps open up new insights and new ways of thinking about ecosystems, in particular with these large, powerful players at the center of the ecosystem, and how they interrelate to the other players in the ecosystem and what that can mean. And I think that the fact that it's got this formal model sitting behind it generates rigor. It provides some sense of assurance that sits behind the theory, that there's actually math that makes it all add up. And so it's been for me, it was a paper that I probably wouldn't have otherwise picked up, but I'm incredibly glad that I did because of doing this interview. And so I hope that others will be encouraged to pick it up, to read it, in particular, those who teach strategy and incorporate some elements of ecosystems or platform strategy into their classes, and want to do further research in those areas. I think it can be incredibly generative for that. So thank you, David, for agreeing to spend the time with us. Is there anything else we haven't touched on that you think is important for listeners to take away from this paper that might be generative for them or might be useful for them? And if not, we can wrap things up.
Yes, there is one thing. So one of the things that we show is that if you adopt cooperative governance, a very specific form of cooperative governance, but that one that actually tends to be I should back up. One of the most common features of cooperative governance, some even call it a canonical feature, is that your ownership stake is based on how much you contribute. So if it's a cooperative bank, how much money do you have deposited at the bank? If it's a ocean spray, how many cranberries do you as a farmer deliver to them, and so on? We show that if you have a cooperative that has that kind of governance structure, it completely eliminates the baleful effects of the lead firm's market power. Not only do we think that's interesting, more broadly, we need to do a lot more research on cooperative governance. People don't realize how many cooperatives are out there, but some of the largest banks, agricultural concerns, hardware stores, you name it, are actually cooperatives. And if you care about stakeholder theory, you care about governance, we need to devote more attention to that.
Oh man, I'm glad you double clicked on that. It opened up a lot of, from when I read the paper, some of the really interesting things, the hardware stores that operate as cooperatives, and that being a potentially valuable governance mechanism for thinking about sort of these gnarly challenges in other areas where there's supply chain difficulties going on, and where there's holdup and rapid inflation for a variety of reasons, that just being another governance form that one can put on the table and think about if you're making those decisions. But from a research standpoint, it being a domain that needs more attention and needs to be opened up. So appreciate you highlighting that.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for participating in this. Thank you for continuing to submit to AMR. And I know you've got another paper in press at AMR, and so we may get to talk about that at some point in the future. But for the time being, that's it, and thank you very much.